In the early morning hours of Friday, November 2nd of this past year, less than a week after the horrific shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the editors of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette made a radical decision. For only the second time in the history of our nation, a major newspaper decided that it would run a front-page headline in Hebrew letters over a series of stories describing the heart-wrenching memorial services for the 11 victims of the senseless murder. The readers saw the words, Yitgadal v'yitgadash Shemei Rabbah. The headline continued, "These are the first words of the Jewish mourner's prayer. Magnified and sanctified be your name. To be recited tonight, the first Sabbath, since the tragedy of the Tree of Life." Describing his decision to place a headline in Hebrew at the top of the paper, Post-Gazette executive editor David Shribman wrote, "When you conclude that there are no words to express a community's feelings, then maybe you are thinking in the wrong language." Writing like this is why the staff of the Post-Gazette received the Pulitzer Prize earlier this year. The citation noted their immersive, compassionate coverage, which captured the anguish and resilience of a community thrust into grief. To understand just how significant the Post-Gazette's Aramaic headline was, I want to spend some time this morning exploring its only antecedent in the history of our country, a Hebrew language headline that ran some 85 years ago this month on Rosh Hashanah in 1934 in the Detroit Free Press. To understand this headline, though, one has to know something of Detroit in the 1930s. By the 1930s, Detroit had become a center of American anti-Semitism, primarily due to the efforts of industrialist Henry Ford. Ford's anti-Semitism may have stemmed from his own business interests. He blamed Jewish trade unionists for impacting his labor supply and Jewish car dealers for undermining Ford sales practices. But his anti-Semitic beliefs were not limited to his personal sphere. He felt that the First World War was brought about by profiteering Jewish bankers who sought to benefit from the conflict. He believed that Jews were using Hollywood and jazz music to corrupt America's youth. Jews were, in short, conspiring to control the world. In the 1920s, Ford acquired the Dearborn Independent, a Michigan newspaper he used to spread his ideas. Beginning in May of that year, he printed a series of columns titled "The International Jew, the World's Problem." Throughout the decade, the paper would become a platform for ideas that helped to fan the flames of anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant thought, and prohibition. It was a fun paper. It helped to popularize the famous protocols of the Elders of Zion and may have played a role in the revival of the Klan in the 1920s. In writing Mein Kampf in 1925, Adolf Hitler named Henry Ford as the singular American standing up to the Jews. That same year, Jewish attorney Aaron Shapiro sued Ford for defamation. Ford spent the next 16 months in hiding, evading a subpoena, and was mysteriously hospitalized in a Ford hospital when the trial finally occurred. Ford did close the newspaper in 1927, perhaps because of a lawsuit brought by the Anti-Defamation League, but its ideas lived on. Throughout the 1930s, the Midwest continued to witness a rise of what today we would call white nationalism. The Black Knights, a radical offshoot of the Klan, flourished in the Detroit area, and in the 1930s was likely responsible for the murders of Jewish Union leaders. Later in the decade, the German-American Bund, that is the Nazi Party in America, flourished in Detroit, while the anti-Semitic priest, Father Coughlin, amassed a weekly radio audience of close to 30 million. By 1934, when the Free Press ran its Hebrew language headline, anti-Semitism had taken a prominent role on the world stage as well. Adolf Hitler had become the Chancellor of Germany just a year prior, and in the summer of 1934, the Nazi government had begun to enact its anti-Semitic policies. Quotas were established for the number of non-Aryans in the civil service and within educational institutions, limiting the number to no greater than 1.5%. Jews were banned entirely from the field of accounting, and in 1934, all Jewish actors were barred from the stage and screen. To Ford and his supporters, this all was likely welcome news. In fact, he continued to support the Nazi government throughout his life. In 1938, Hitler recognized him with the Order of the German Eagle, an honor he gladly accepted. Towards the end of his life, he would claim that Jews had pulled America into the Second World War, and that his signature on the Marshall Plan had been forged. Against this backdrop, an unlikely hero emerged in the summer of 1934. Hank Greenberg, born Hyman Benjamin Greenberg to Romanian parents David and Sarah, was in his second season in the big leagues, playing for the Detroit Tigers. At just 21 years old, he was one of the league's youngest players. He was also one of its best. Greenberg was not the first Jewish hero to captivate the imagination of America's Jewish immigrant community. As early as 1920, John McGraw, the manager of the New York Giants, realized that a Jewish star would increase ticket sales by attracting the new immigrant community to the Polo Grounds. As he would later tell the New York Times, a home run hitter with a Jewish name would be worth $1 million. So McGraw fielded Moshe Solomon, known as the Rabbi of SWAT, the Jewish Babe Ruth. He played 2 games in 1923. Andy Cohen had a better run for the Giants in 1928. He had 2 runs batted in on opening day, but Nebuch retired to an injury just a year later. These players, though, proved that acceptance in baseball was a kind of stand-in for acceptance in America. The Jewish Daily Forward began to print giant box scores on the front page of the newspaper and ran an article explaining the rules of the game in Yiddish. By the time Greenberg took the stage, Jews understood that success in baseball symbolized success in America. Now, I should say, we've always been particularly proud of our Jewish sports stars. I don't bring visual aids. I think they're kind of tacky, but I brought a visual aid for my sermon today. Okay, so this was from Jewish Heritage Night at the A's this year. I kept mine folded. Did people get their Ken Holtzman? Right? So now as I understand it, he was a member of this congregation when he lived in the Bay, and he was very good, right? He was a very good pitcher. But I think to understand Hank Greenberg, we have to realize he wasn't just very good or very good for a Jewish baseball player. He was great. In batting, his batting average his rookie season was .301. Now, I'm not a baseball fan. You can check with Chazan Dinkin, but I believe that's really good, right? In 1934, he was leading the league with a batting average of .339. For comparison, now I wrote this a few weeks ago, maybe 10 days, the best batting average when I wrote my sermon this season belonged to Tim Anderson, who is batting .332 for the White Sox. So even in comparison to the best batting average in the league today, Hank Greenberg would have been ahead, and that was, pre-steroids and everything else. So Greenberg's hitting for the Tigers led them to their first pennant bid since 1901. In September of 1934, with the season coming to a close, the Tigers held just a 4-game lead over the Yankees, but they were in a slump. With the Jewish holidays approaching, Hank Greenberg faced a question. Would he play on Rosh Hashanah and support his team? The question, Greenberg realized, was not just to play or not. Instead, he knew the choice would have broader implication for how Jews were perceived in America. If he did not play, people might accuse Jews of being more loyal to their own people than to their fellow countrymen. But if he chose to play, he might be making it more difficult for other Jews to take off work to celebrate the holiday. Despite his youth, Greenberg realized the seriousness of this decision. And perhaps because he'd not made up his mind, he shared his thinking with no one. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the city was abuzz. What would Greenberg do? It was in this moment that the Detroit Free Press made a bold decision. Still unaware of his choice, in a city rife with anti-Semitism, the Free Press printed above the fold in large Hebrew letters, Lashana Tova Tikatevu. To you, Mr. Greenberg, the Tiger fans say, Lashana Tova, Happy New Year. To this day, historians wonder where in the world the Free Press acquired the Hebrew movable type to set the headline. Maybe a Yiddish newspaper. In the end, what did Greenberg do? Apparently, he sought the advice of Rabbi Joseph Thumim, a renowned Reform rabbi, who suggested that the Talmud might allow him to play on the sacred day. On the morning of Rosh Hashanah, Greenberg donned his suit and attended services at Sharei Zedek, Detroit's oldest conservative congregation. Then, still dressed in his finery, he headed to the ballpark. He didn't immediately suit up, and he skipped batting practice. Instead, he asked starting pitcher Eldon Ocker what he should do. Is that how you say that? I don't know. Ocker was a native of Kansas and later claimed that Greenberg was the first Jewish person he'd ever met. All he knew was that it was a lot easier to pitch behind good hitters, and he shared as much with Greenberg, who dressed and got ready to take his place at first base. The result? A 2-1 victory for the Tigers, with Greenberg hitting a walk-off home run to win the game. L'Shana Tova indeed. 10 days later on Yom Kippur, Greenberg made a different choice. He couldn't imagine playing on the holiday, not only because of what it would mean for his community, but especially what it would mean for his parents. This time, the Free Press ran a poem by Edgar Guest to commemorate the occasion, a send-up of Casey at the bat. It reads, "The Irish didn't like it when they heard Greenberg's name, for they thought a good first baseman should possess an Irish name, and the Murphys and Mulrooneys, they never dreamed they'd see a Jewish boy from Bronxville out where Casey used to be. In the early days of April, not a Duggan tipped his hat or prayed to see a double when Hank Greenberg came to bat. In July, the Irish wondered where he'd learned to play. He makes me think of Casey, Old Man Murphy dared to say. And with 57 doubles and a score of homers made, the respect they had for Greenberg was openly displayed. But on the Jewish New Year, when Hank Greenberg came to bat and made 2 home runs off pitcher Rhodes, well, they cheered like mad for that. Came Yom Kippur, holy fast day worldwide, over to the Jew, and Hank Greenberg, to his teaching and the old tradition true, spent the day among his people, and he didn't come to play. Said Murphy to Mulrooney, we shall lose the game today. We shall miss him on the infield and miss him at the bat. But he's true to his religion, and we honor him for that." Later, Greenberg would recall, "It's a strange thing. When I was playing, I used to resent being singled out as a Jewish ball player, period. I'm not sure why or when that changed, because I'm still not particularly religious as a person. Lately, though, I find myself wanting to be remembered not only as a great ball player, but even more as a great Jewish ball player. I realize now, more than I used to, how important a part I played in the lives of a generation of kids growing up in the 1930s. I mentioned Hank Greenberg this morning, not just because his life represents an interesting piece of Jewish trivia. The past several years have brought us the most terrifying anti-Semitism I've witnessed in my lifetime. We've seen torchlit parades with chants of Jews will not replace us. Accusations of dual loyalty are trafficked by the fringes of the right and the left. Most horrifyingly, we've come to realize that our houses of worship can become targets. Today, publicly identifying as a Jew is not inconsequential. At 21 years old, Hank Greenberg worked out in public the questions so many of us struggle with in private. How do I balance my commitments to my faith, my people, my heritage, with my commitments to my employer, my community, and my country? To what extent do my decisions make me a role model for my family, for my children, and for my community? Greenberg did not choose this role. He was not a rabbi, not a community leader. Rather, when life called upon him, he found a creative way to bring honor to his people. Though our popular history might have it otherwise, he accomplished this task by seeking a creative balance between his faith and his profession. Ultimately, his decisions were heroic. This is instructive for us. Judaism is not a zero-sum game. We need not be perfect in our faith or perfect in our observance to bring honor to our people. This is not to say, though, that we can be negligent. Our reality today calls upon us to be more aware of our identity, to bring Jewish values into our decision-making, to approach our unique identity with a place of pride. When we do that, we have the opportunity to create legacies that will outlive our lives. Much has changed in the 85 years between the Hebrew headlines in Detroit and in Pittsburgh. In the aftermath of the terrible attacks in Pittsburgh, our nation witnessed an outpouring of concern for the Jewish community that I will never forget. Here in Walnut Creek, perhaps 1,000 people crammed our campus to declare solidarity with the Jewish community. In publishing its Hebrew headline, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was affirming what most Americans already believe, that bigotry, hatred, and racism have no place in our country. That is not to say, though, that there is not important work ahead. As we've painfully learned this year, the resurgence of anti-Semitism in our midst is real. I have faith that, like the Jewish heroes from our history, we will be able to meet this challenge of our time. In just a moment, we'll rise to hear the call of the shofar. This year, may the shofar call us to action. As it did for our ancestors in Jericho, may it bring us strength, courage, and resolve in troubling times. May it inspire us to lives of action, bring honor to our faith, our community, our people. Let its blast be a clarion call to justice, and may it lead us on a path towards Shalom, to lives of completion, to lives